The Witch Herself by Phyllis Reynolds Naylor, Chapter 5. There was no school the following Tuesday because all the teachers were attending a workshop. "I'm going to wash my hair and read a book and just laze around," Judith announced that morning, coming down to breakfast just as Mr. Morley was leaving for the courthouse. "It's starting to get warmer outside," Father said, carrying his plate to the sink. "I'd think you'd want to go hiking and see if you could find some pussy willow along the creek." "Maybe," Judith mused. "I suppose I could take Stevie with me." "That would be a good idea." Mr. Morley glanced at his wife, who sat bundled in a heavy robe at the end of the table, slowly sipping her coffee, her face turned toward the window. "Maybe Lynn could help you move your writing things back to your studio, Sylvia. It's warm enough now, I think. Spring is in the air. You can feel it." "In a few weeks," said Mother. "I'm almost through with my book. Then I'll move back into the studio." Mr. Morley paused, as though he were about to say something more to her, then stopped. He bent over, kissed her goodbye, and left. Lynn, who had been making toast at the counter, took the cinnamon jar with her and sat down beside her mother. "I'd like to go to Mrs. Tuggle's with you today," she said. "I promise I won't talk and disturb you, but I could file or go over clippings or something." Mrs. Morley turned and smiled to her. "I don't have much for you to do in Mrs. Tuggle's house. It's the studio that needs straightening." "Let me go with you anyway, Mother. You said you had a whole envelope full of notes and things on witchcraft. You needed them pasted in a loose leaf binder where you could find them easily." "I did, but my book is almost done now. I won't need the clippings after that." "But you might, Mother. You might do another book on witches someday, and then everything would be in order." "Oh, I suppose so. If you're really looking for something to keep you busy, it would be more to the point, I think, if you stayed home and cleaned out your closet. But you can come if you like." When Mother went back upstairs to dress, Judith faced Lynn across the table. "Something's wrong with her," Judith said. "I don't know what it is, but something's just not right. Dad told me that if she doesn't seem better by April, he's going to have Dr. Thomas come by the house and check her over." "I don't think she's sick," Lynn ventured. "I think it's Mrs. Tuggle." For once, Judith did not laugh at the idea. "I wish she weren't working up there anymore," she agreed, "but I don't know why." There were light footsteps on the stairs, and Stevie came into the kitchen in his stocking feet, still in pajamas, but wearing an enormous old hat that Mr. Morley used to wear on fishing trips. "What are you supposed to be?" Lynn smiled, pouring his cereal for him and slicing banana over it. Stevie grinned. "It's my detective hat. Daddy said I could wear it." "You're working on a case, huh?" "Yeah." Stevie climbed up at his chair and tucked his feet under him. "Mrs. Tuggle hired me." Lynn stood still and looked at Stevie. "To do what?" Judith asked. "To find her cat. She said if I found him, she'd give me a whole $1, and she said if I don't find him but found out what happened to him, she'd pay me 50 cents. Lynn busied herself, clearing up the counter. "So, where do you think you'll look?" "I don't know. I'm going to knock on all the doors on this street and ask if anybody's seen a big brown cat." Lynn felt a tinge of guilt when she realized all the work Stevie was going to do to find out nothing, but her heart stood still when she heard him say, "I'm going to ask everyone if they've seen a cat with a chain around its neck with a thing on the end that looks like a spider. Mrs. Tuggle said even if I didn't find the cat, but I found the chain, she'd give me $1 anyway." He remembers it, Lynn thought. If he just won't mention it to Mother. "I was going for a hike along the creek, Stevie," Judith told him. "Want to go with me? Maybe we'll see the cat back in the woods somewhere." Lynn went upstairs and put on her jeans and checked to make sure the chain was still in her top dresser drawer. Then she went downstairs, threw on her coat, and went outside with Mother. The sky overhead was definitely March. It was clear and blue, and white puffs of clouds were moving rapidly in the force of the wind, making Lynn dizzy as she watched them sailing by. The air was still cold, but the sun incredibly warm on the back of her neck, and she trotted down the steps to the brick walk below, and then began the long climb beside Mother to the house at the top of the hill. Usually when Mother and Lynn were alone going somewhere together, Mrs. Morley made the most of the time, asking Lynn questions about school or Marjorie or her feelings about herself. It was always a time for sharing thoughts and worries and secrets, enjoying being together without continual interruptions from the rest of the family. But today, Mrs. Morley moved up the hill against the wind, tight-lipped and silent, wrapped up in her own thoughts. She even walked a few feet ahead of Lynn, as though she hardly even realized that her daughter was along. It made Lynn feel terribly lonely and left out. Just before they reached Mrs. Tuggle's gate, however, Mrs. Morley stopped and knelt over something there on the grass. "Look, Lynn," she said, and her voice again had the soft sound it used to have. "Daffodils! In a few more weeks they'll be in bloom." She slipped one arm around Lynn and pointed out the green stems growing in the shade of some bushes. Lynn leaned against her mother and wished she could make the moment last. It was as though Mother was slipping away from her, from all of them, and no one quite knew what to do to bring her back. They knocked at the big oak door, and Lynn stared hard at the troll door knocker. Then she blinked. The eyes did move. She was sure of it. This time, instead of backing away, Lynn stepped forward and stared hard at the knocker. Then she discovered that the metal eyes of the creature had small holes in the center so that someone standing on the other side of the door could look out. Mrs. Tuggle had been watching. The door opened. Mrs. Tuggle smiled at Mother, but did not smile at Lynn. "I've brought a helper today, Mrs. Tuggle," Mother explained. "It's certainly a nice morning, isn't it?" "Aye, not as cold as it was yesterday," the old woman said. Lynn followed her mother up the stairs, but she had the uneasy feeling that Mrs. Tuggle was staring after her. When they reached the top, she paused for a moment and looked back. Mrs. Tuggle was standing at the bottom, and her face was terrible. Her eyes, like two simmering coals, blazed out at Lynn under her heavy black eyebrows, and she looked like an animal ready to spring. Lynn hurried on after her mother and closed the upstairs door behind them. She had scarcely settled herself in one corner of the room when Mother's loose leaf binder in her lap, and there was a light tap at the door, and Mrs. Tuggle came in, carrying a pot of tea and 2 cups. "Ah, my morning tea," Mrs. Morley said, putting down her pen and smiling. "See how she pampers me, Lynn? There's nothing like a spot of hot tea on a cold morning to warm the fingers," said the old woman, setting the tray down on the corner of Mother's desk. She sounded, Lynn decided, like the witch in Hansel and Gretel, fattening up Hansel and checking his fingers each morning. Lynn said nothing. She watched Mrs. Tuggle go out again, but noticed the door did not close all the way. She could just make out Mrs. Tuggle's eyes through the crack. For several moments the eyes kept their silent watch. They finally disappeared, and Lynn could hear the old woman's footsteps retreating down the stairs. She shivered. "Want some tea, Lynn?" Mrs. Morley asked, pouring a cup for herself. "No," Lynn said, "I don't need anything." As the morning wore on, however, Lynn realized that her mother's writing seemed to be going slower and slower. When Mrs. Morley first sat down at the desk, she had seemed perky and energetic and eager to get to her manuscript. By 10 o'clock, however, she sat leaning back in her chair, holding the cup in her hands, letting the strange, fragrant mist bathe her face. Only occasionally, then, did she pick up her pen, and when she wrote at all, her eyes seemed to be half closed. "The tea," thought Lynn. That was it. Hadn't Mother mentioned once that even when she worked in her studio outside, Mrs. Tuggle brought her tea sometimes? Now she was drinking it every day. There was something about that tea. Lynn continued her cutting and arranging and pasting of the clippings in the notebook, but her mind was rushing on ahead, tumbling over ideas. Perhaps this was how Mrs. Tuggle was gaining control over her mother. Perhaps it was the tea that was making Mother brooding and distant. Why hadn't Lynn thought of this before? Memories came rushing back. Each time during the past year that she and Marjorie had come to visit the old woman, Mrs. Tuggle had gone right to the kitchen and boiled the water for tea. Even when they politely declined it, she tried to persuade them to drink it anyway. And once, after drinking a full cup, Mouse had seemed to fall under a spell. "'Tis my own special brew," Mrs. Tuggle had told them once, "made of branch water." She told them that she collected the herbs herself from the woods and meadows, and used the water in Cowden's Creek, which she boiled in the old pot on her stove. "I think I may have some of that tea after all," Lynn said suddenly, going over to the tray and pouring some in the second cup. "It won't be very hot," Mother commented. "That's okay." Lynn sat down with the tea. It was barely warm. She sipped it slowly, feeling nothing. Perhaps the tea had to be hot to have an effect. Perhaps it was the mist and the steam swirling into the facial pores that made the eyelids heavy and the lower lip seem to sag, giving the impression almost that the drinker had been drugged. Lynn put down the cup and concentrated on her work again. She was trimming an old yellowed clipping that Mother had cut out of a newspaper several years ago and stuffed into her witchcraft folder. "Charm believed responsible for man's death," it said, and Lynn glanced at it as she prepared it for the notebook. Then she stopped suddenly and read it again. It told about a man in Britain who jumped to his death from a cliff into the sea. His sister blamed a charm that he was wearing about his neck, which she said a witch had once given to him. The sister went on to say that she had heard that when a person wore an evil charm, a part of himself would fall under the spell of witches, and they could command the person to do things that ordinarily he would not do. Lynn thought again of the charm the cat had worn about its neck. What if Judith discovered it, put it on, and found herself in Mrs. Tuggle's control after her long ordeal the previous summer? What if little Stevie, playing detective, found the charm and put it around his neck? Lynn shuddered. She would have to hide it in a better place. And then Lynn realized that the tea was having an effect after all. The scissors slid off her lap onto the floor, and as she reached for them, she felt just a little dizzy. She was reacting more slowly than usual, she discovered. She felt sleepy, as though in an unguarded moment her eyelids would close of their own accord. So this was what had been happening to Mother. It took all the energy Lynn could muster to finish the page she was working on. At noon, Mother got out their sandwiches, and they sat nibbling them quietly. Lynn had hoped that at lunch they could relax and talk to each other, but Mrs. Tuggle appeared with a new pot of tea, and Mother poured herself another cup and sat over it in silence. Lynn drank no more, but by 1 o'clock she was beginning to feel a little more like herself, more awake. But during this time her mind had been clear enough to come to a decision. She would find some way to steal down to Mrs. Tuggle's kitchen and take away her supply of tea. She had gone down the hall to use the bathroom and was just coming back when she heard the sound of the heavy knocker on the front door. She stood very still in the shadows at the top of the stairs and listened. She heard Mrs. Tuggle's footsteps on the floor below and the slow creak of the big door. Finally, a man's voice filled the entrance hall. "Mrs. Eleanor Tuggle?" "Yes." "Good afternoon. I'm Mr. Sims from the county sheriff's office, and we've been asked by the folks at the courthouse to help bring some of their records up to date." Mrs. Tuggle did not reply, so the man went on. "I believe you have a relative buried at the old cemetery?" "Two of them, my brother and my husband." "Yes, that's what we were told, but it seems that the death certificate for your brother is missing, and I've got to ask you some questions to help us locate it. Would you mind if I stepped in for a few minutes? It's all routine, you understand." "Of course. Do come in and have some tea." "Oh, no thank you, ma'am. Never touch it." Mr. Sims laughed a little, "but you go right ahead and make yourself a cup. Still pretty cold outside." The voices grew softer as Mrs. Tuggle and her visitor went into the parlor, and then Lynn could hear Mrs. Tuggle's footsteps in the kitchen where she was putting the kettle on the boil. This was her chance. She would wait until she heard voices in the parlor again. Mrs. Tuggle would be talking with the man at least 10 minutes. She would slip down to the kitchen and take the whole supply of tea. She returned to the room where Mother was working. This time Mrs. Morley had her head down in her arms on the desk, as though she had fallen asleep. Perfect, absolutely perfect. She moved out into the hall again, waiting. Finally, she heard the sound of voices again in the parlor, and the clink of Mrs. Tuggle's teacup on her saucer. The interview had begun. Stealthily, she made her way down the stairs, a step at a time. Just before she reached the bottom, where she would be seen through the doorway to the parlor, she climbed over the stair railing and let herself slowly down on the other side. A moment later, she was standing in the dark kitchen, and the cupboards loomed high above her. Somehow Lynn had thought that when she walked in the kitchen, she would find 4 canisters on the counter labeled flour, sugar, coffee, and tea, and that all she would have to do would be to empty out the tea into a paper bag and leave. The high, dark counter, however, did not at all resemble Mother's kitchen at home, with things neatly labeled and a large space left bare for Mrs. Morley to do her kneading and rolling and cutting. There was only one window in the Tuggle kitchen, besides the one at the back door, and it was high up in the wall, as though purposely designed to prevent people from looking in. And, because little sunlight fell in the room, the corners were dark and the cupboards themselves cast shadows on the counter below, which was cluttered with crocks and bowls and tall vinegary-looking bottles which gave no clue at all as to where the tea was kept. From down the dark hallway, there was a pause in the conversation, and Lynn stopped in her tracks, her heart beating faster. Then the voices began again. "You have no copy of the death certificate yourself, Mrs. Tuggle?" "Sure I am it somewhere, but I'm an old woman, Mr. Sims. 'Twas a long time ago. I lost my brother. Things pile up in an old lady's house, you know. Why, I have boxes in my attic and trunks in the cellar and drawers full of old papers." Lynn crept quietly over to the cupboard nearest the stove. This was certainly the most logical place for her to look. Mrs. Tuggle drank tea so often that she would probably keep it close to the kettle on the stove. She reached up and softly opened the cupboard door, pausing to see if the slight click of the latch had interrupted the conversation in the front room, but the voices continued. "It would be a great help to us, Mrs. Tuggle, if you would look through your papers at your earliest convenience and see if perhaps you could find a copy of the death certificate. Then we could make a duplicate of it for our files, and would not have to trouble you about it again." "There are half a dozen trunks, Mr. Sims," Mrs. Tuggle told him, "and more boxes than I can count. Old ladies are collectors, you know. It would take me several years to go through it all." "Perhaps I could arrange to have some clerks from the office help you." Mrs. Tuggle's laugh was soft and harsh at the same time. Lynn, listening from the kitchen, wondered if the man from the sheriff's office realized that it had taken on a different quality. "'Twould not be that easy to find. 'Tis likely I've tucked it in a letter somewhere. A personal letter, you know. I don't think I would want your clerks opening my personal letters." "They wouldn't read them, of course, Mrs. Tuggle." "No, it is best done by me. Perhaps when the weather is warmer and the attic is not so cold." There was nothing on the shelf that looked like tea to Lynn. There were several jars of jelly and a few cans of spice. There was a tall crock of pickles and some mustard and a can of cocoa. Softly she closed the door and opened another. Dishes, nothing but cups and saucers and dessert plates. Her elbow banged the door as she was withdrawing her hand and made a dull thud. She stood rooted to the floor, her mouth open so that even her breathing was stilled. For what seemed like a stretch of 20 or 30 seconds, there was no sound at all from the living room. Finally, however, the squeak of Mrs. Tuggle's rocking chair began again, and Lynn heard Mr. Sims say, "In case we don't ever find that certificate, Mrs. Tuggle, would you please describe for me as accurately as possible the circumstances of your brother's death? I know it was a long time ago." "And the memory of an old woman is no longer sharp," Mrs. Tuggle added. "Of course, I understand, but it would be helpful to us if we could have your account for our records, so that if there is ever a question—" "A question, Mr. Sims? What is there to ask about a fine young lad carried off by the flood when he was a mere 16? Seems enough sadness to last forever without stirring it up again after so many years. Believe me, Mrs. Tuggle, I can understand how hard this must be for you, and we've no wish to subject you to an unnecessary ordeal, but you must understand our position also. There cannot help but be questions when it has been discovered that the only death certificate out of all those buried in the old cemetery, that only one death certificate out of all those buried in the cemetery is missing. Then the question should go to the courthouse, not to me, young man. 'Tis not me who misfiled it." "Of course not, but it's important for us to establish that there was indeed a death certificate made out for your brother. Can you tell me how long after he was discovered missing that the body was found?" 2 days, Mr. Sims. Early in the morning. For 2 days we searched, and then my husband found the body caught in the weeds and rocks at the bottom of the old footbridge, or where the footbridge was, because sure the bridge was under water, so deep the creek ran that spring. "And then what, Mrs. Tuggle?" "Then we buried him, of course." "But did no one else see him? No doctor?" "Why should we have called a doctor, Mr. Sims? The lad was dead." "But surely you reported it. Surely the county sent someone out, the coroner." "I'm sure that my husband did whatever needed to be done," Mrs. Tuggle said tersely. "As for me, the grief was so deep that I do not really remember." Lynn had been so entranced with the conversation that she had momentarily forgotten the tea. She stood there by the cupboard, listening, straining to hear. "My husband made the coffin himself," Mrs. Tuggle's voice went on. "Oak it was, I remember, and we buried him there in the old cemetery." "Was there a funeral?" "We did not have many friends in those days, Mr. Sims, but of course we told the neighbours." "And the gravestone, what about that?" "We ordered it and put it on a year later. A pretty penny it cost us too, but I wanted the boy to have a gravestone like none other. There he rests. Lynn knew she would have to hurry if she were to find the tea before the conversation ended. She moved quickly to the next cupboard in the corner and opened the door. This cupboard was even darker, full of little cloth bags. She quickly picked up the first little bag and peered inside. Cornmeal. She put it back and tried a second. Raisins. She reached for a sack near the back and squeezed it, feeling the dry crunch of leaves that would mean tea. Suddenly, "What are you doing in my kitchen?" Mrs. Tuggle seemed to have appeared from nowhere, and grabbed Lynn's arm so tightly that Lynn gave a little cry. The old woman's fingers felt icy cold, like the touch of death itself. Lynn's first impulse was to scream. At least it would signal someone that she was in trouble. Then she heard the front door close and knew that Mr. Sims had left. Mother was upstairs. Mrs. Tuggle dared not hurt her with Mother in the house, but suddenly she thought of a better answer than a scream. "We wanted some more tea," she said, and tried to sound as polite and convincing as she could under the circumstances. "I saw that you had a visitor and didn't want to interrupt you, but I couldn't find the tea." Mrs. Tuggle's fingers relaxed and her eyes showed a trace of pleased surprise. "More tea your mother wants, eh? Well, I shall fix up a pot and take it to her." She reached back into a dark shelf, one that Lynn had not yet searched, and brought down a small tin of tea, then reached under the stove and pulled out a burlap sack. "Go on," she said suddenly to Lynn. "'Twill take a while to brew. I'll bring it up myself when it's ready." Lynn walked slowly upstairs, thinking. The can of tea looked like any that she could buy at a store. There was nothing at all unusual about it, but the burlap sack. Something had been sticking out of the top, something familiar. What was it? And then she remembered a certain plant that grew along the bank by Mrs. Tuggle's portion of the creek. The stems had obviously been picked in the fall when they were dry and tasseled. It must be that the old woman grew it and used it to mix with other tea. "My own special brew," she used to say. Of course, that was it. It was not the tea at all, but what she added to it. Mother was still resting with her head in her arms. She did not seem to have moved at all. Lynn was beginning to feel worried. "Mother?" she said lightly, shaking her arm. "Mother, are you okay?" Mrs. Morley sat up slowly, looking groggily about, and covered her face with her hands. "I'm so sleepy," she said. "Is it too warm up here, or is it just me?" "It is sort of warm," Lynn said. "I'll turn off the radiator and you see if that helps." "I'll turn off the radiator for you and see if that helps." Mother yawned. "Thanks, dear. How's the work coming?" "I've finished a whole folder. I think I'll go to Marjorie's now, if you don't mind." "Of course not. Go ahead." Mother sat up and picked up the papers in front of her to look them over. "I wonder if I will ever finish the last chapter. I thought that being up here in Mrs. Tuggle's house would help. The atmosphere, the gloom, put me in the right frame of mind, but it seems to be taking forever. I keep falling asleep, and if I keep going to sleep, what can I expect from my readers?" Lynn was about to answer that she didn't think it was the writing that was putting Mother to sleep, but rather the tea, or what was in it. But at that moment, footsteps sounded in the hall, and Mrs. Tuggle came in. As soon as she entered, her back to Lynn picked up her coat and stole quickly through the doorway and down the stairs to the kitchen. Noisily, she opened the cupboard beneath the stove, grabbed the big burlap sack of herbs, thrust it under her coat, and went out the front door. Just as she heard Mrs. Tuggle's feet on the stairs again, she ran as though all the fiends of hell were behind her, her coat lumpy and huge from the bag beneath it. She did not stop running until she was halfway down the block. Then she slowed to a fast walk and thrust her nose under her coat to sniff at the bag. That was it. That was the smell exactly. She knocked at the Beasley's door and waited. Mouse was eating a peanut butter and onion sandwich. She was the only person Lynn had ever known who carefully spread her bread with butter, then with peanut butter, and then thin, transparent slices of Bermuda onion. It had to be Bermuda, Mouse always said. Lynn could smell what she was eating before she saw the peanut butter. "What's this?" Mouse asked, looking at the sack. "We're going to have a tea party," Lynn said. "Tea is in Boston." "What? What are you talking about?" "We're about to have a Boston tea party, Mouse. I want you to come with me and dump this sack in the creek." "Where did you get it?" "It's Mrs. Tuggle's entire supply of whatever it is she's been putting in her tea, I hope." Marjorie's eyes grew huge and her mouth dropped open, showing the peanut butter on her teeth. "You're kidding!" "See for yourself." Lynn opened the bag. "It's just a mess of weeds," Mouse said. "Not weeds exactly. It's an herb of some sort, and it only grows along Mrs. Tuggle's part of the creek. She planted them there, I'm sure of it. She crumbles up the tassels, I bet, and brews them along with tea from the store." Marjorie stood, staring quizzically down into the bag. "But why do you want to get rid of it, Lynn? It will only make her furious. She's English, you know. She can't live without tea." "Maybe not, but she can live without this stuff in it, and Mom will live a lot better without it." "I'm sure that this is pulling Mother into Mrs. Tuggle's power. Do you remember last summer when Mrs. Tuggle gave us some tea and you almost fell asleep, just like Mother's doing? It must have the same kind of narcotic effect. It makes us more suggestible, more easy to manipulate. But Lynn, when she discovers the sack is gone, she'll just go down and get some more. She has to wait till the plant tassels again, Mouse. See, this is the part she uses. Lynn crumpled some up in her hand. They won't tassel again till fall. She'll be livid. She'll hate us forever. She already does, Mouse. Oh, Lynn, it just won't work. She'll just find another way to control your mother. If she can't make tea, she'll mix up some other potion and call it something else. She's probably working on it right now. It's a chance we'll have to take, Mouse. Come on. I almost expect her to come running down here after us. It was starting to rain. The air was decidedly warmer now than it had been for some time. Soon the spring rains would begin, and then the peach trees would bloom, and after that the honeysuckle would flood the air with its fragrant smell. As the girls started across the Beasley backyard and to the creek beyond, Lynn felt a special longing for summer, for an end to the cold and the gloom and the fear that wouldn't seem to let go. She wanted to spend her summers sitting lazily on the back porch glider with Mouse, singing a duet, or planning a slumber party, or making chocolate chip cookies with Stevie. She wished that Mrs. Tuggle would just disintegrate. She decided as they reached the creek and dumped the contents of the sack into the water. She wished that the old woman would just float away as the stalks of the plant were doing, just their tassels caught in the current, twisting and whirling, and then rushing on down the hill toward the business district. She and Mouse stood there silently and watched them go. Lynn Morley, what on earth have you done? Lynn whirled around. There was Mother striding across the field, her face wet with the rain, and the scarf, which held back her hair from her face, hanging bedraggled over one shoulder. Lynn could not think of a reply. Mother, you're soaking wet, was all she could say. And so are you, young lady. What is this all about? What is what all about? Lynn asked feebly as Mouse shrank back. This! Mrs. Morley pointed to the empty bag. What have you done with Mrs. Tuggle's tea? As soon as you left her house, she came upstairs and said she suspected you had stolen her tea. I couldn't imagine such a thing. I called home, but Judith said you weren't there, so I knew you were with Marjorie. Mrs. Morley's eyes, angry and unsympathetic, darted back and forth from Lynn to Mouse. I dumped it in the creek, Lynn said. You what? Mrs. Morley stared at her. Do you realize that is her entire supply of tea? Inside, Lynn felt jubilant. She was afraid that perhaps the old woman had bushels of it left in her cellar. No, she said to her mother, she has plenty of tea. It's this plant, this drug that she's out of now. Mother, she's been putting it in your tea every day to get control of your mind. Mother angrily snatched the sack away from Lynn. That's nonsense, utter nonsense. I'm upset and angry with you, Lynn Morley. Mother, please believe me. You know how sleepy you've been feeling. You know how difficult it's been for you to finish that chapter. I'm trying to save you before it's too late. Go home, Lynn, her mother said coldly. I will never invite you to Mrs. Tuggle's house with me again. And that is the end of chapter 5.